Thank you so much, Lydia, for leading us on the first part of our data values community meeting. Can everyone hear me? Lydia, can you give me a thumbs up? Thank you. So I'm Navina Mutabas from the United Republic of Tanzania, and I'm a data values advocate. 2024, a lovely program with the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data. And I am going to take you through the concepts of data values and data equity and what is been happening on ground from advocates, and specifically tapping into the work that I've been doing from January to now. Next, Fatuma. So to begin with the concepts of data equity, I was hoping to see some responses on the chat, but I'll continue monitoring that. So for us, those who are data-driven, and we love data ethics in the works that we do within the community, simply data equity for us is to focus on ensuring that data benefits everyone, and everyone, it also means mostly marginalized groups or vulnerable groups like women, young people, children, people living with disabilities, and all other groups in their desegregation within communities, especially those that are left out normally, and they are normally the ones that experiences data inequalities. And in a bigger concept, data equity comes from collecting, how data is being collected, to how it's being analyzed, and how it's being used to avoid any form of bias or injustices and discrimination. So data equity is, again, simply to tell that data is a complex story that includes diverse voices, from the first point of how it's being collected to how it's being managed, disseminated, and used. Championing for data equity, especially for us advocates and other people that we have found in the ecosystem of creating a fairer data future, is to promote a community involvement where everyone feels that they are sharing their power in how decisions of data are being made. So it is not about the few having voices in data, but more everyone having voices in data decision. And again, data equity is also about prioritizing and helping decision makers to use data and build strong, inclusive communities, policies, and practices. For my experience, there is already misconceptions around data discussions being complex discussions that should be discussed by few individuals that are experts. So to demystify this, we are championing for data equity to support even decision makers that might also have the same perspective around data equity. Next. So the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, through various programs, including the Data Values Project, where we advocates are selected annually, have created a very interesting roadmap to support individuals on how they can become data-driven and ensure data equity in their work. And that is a tool that guides us, which is the Data Values Manifesto. So with the manifesto is a global movement which challenges power structures in data to ensure that we all share benefits. The manifesto puts in place 5 principles that can help you to improve your work and your data practices, to say that you are a great champion of data equity. So the manifesto challenges everyone, from individuals, governments, commercial companies, CSOs, and even grassroots organizations on how they can make positive changes through how they are handling data, collecting, disseminating, and using data. Next. So to take you through the 5 principles, just in short, the first principle of our manifesto, and as I finish speaking, I can share the link on the chat, is, first of all, we are championing for how people can be supported on how they are represented in data. So for us, we believe that for one to say that you are practicing data equity, you should ensure that there is representation of all groups in how you are capturing their data, especially those historically misrepresented groups, indigenous groups, women, to mention a few, women, children, young people, people living with disabilities, people that are from indigenous communities that might not understand the common languages that are being used in spaces, that you should ensure that when you are collecting data, they are actively involved, and even when you are making decisions of your data, they are actively involved in the decision. So that's the first value. And then the second value is investing in public participation for data accountability. This means that as you are practicing your data practices, you ensure that governments, civil societies, and everyone else that is involved comes in place to be accountable on the data that they are collecting. And we also have other advanced values such as investing in public open data system, as well as ensuring that these public open data systems are accessed by everyone. And lastly, also investing in data skills for all groups, including marginalized groups. Next. Fatuma, next. I would like to finish up by speaking with a small community project that I did in Tanzania. I focused on the first value of the manifesto, which is ensuring representation of grassroots groups. I conducted a project called the Fem Data Power Project, which brought in grassroots feminist organizations in Tanzania together to empower them on a culture of data transparency, ethical data use, as well as data sharing. For me, through a short survey that I conducted, I learned that grassroots feminist organizations are normally left out in critical data discussions, like things like privacy and protection of data. So through the Fem Data Power Project, it's basically a project that I brought 25 feminists together in the room, have a discussion around data, challenges they face around how they are collecting data, using and managing their data. And the bigger picture is to ensure that they also have a say in data, and their voices, especially the voices of marginalized groups they work in the community, is also reflected in the work that they do. Next. So one interesting exercise we did in the room is ensuring that feminists were able to understand the manifesto. We did a building data challenge deck where feminists tried to solve challenges that could happen when they are handling data, such as giving out unconsented information of vulnerable groups, and what could they do to improve. So what happened is they recommended things like improving data sharing within themselves through organizing closed-ended feminist events, compared it to open sharing of the data of the vulnerable groups that they are collecting. But also they developed an urge to say that they are going to invest in sensitive data protection, such as using encrypted passwords, using advanced data protection system, and also now championing, even with donors, to add more resources to their work so that they can protect the data of the vulnerable groups that they are engaging with. In the end, we also signed a commitment as a manifesto. It was seen in the first photo, to say that from now on, regardless of them being grassroots in the Tanzanian communities, they are going to be data-driven, and they will ensure equity is being the first point of priority when they are handling data of vulnerable groups. To me, the Fem Data Power Project was more of an eye-opener to grassroots feminists themselves on how critical data discussions can be localized to fit their own context and solve community challenges, and in the end, demystify the narration that data discussions are complex discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, Navina. Okay, great. So we're going to dive straight into some exploration of data equity and what it means from some of the partners in the data values community. And first up, I'm really excited that we're going to have Joanne Stonia and Lauren Woodman from the World Economic Forum Future Council on Data Equity. So over to you.
Thanks so much, Lydia. Very much appreciate being here today and appreciate the conversation. So I want to start with where Joanne and I and Stephanie and Carla, all of whom are here representing the Global Future Council on Data Equity, that has been stood up for the last couple of years at the World Economic Forum, where we came to this question of data equity. And we started with the recognition that continuously considering the human impact of data, as Navina just noted, is of critical importance, given the fact that data-driven systems in today's world are increasingly important and impact every aspect of our lives. But despite the fact that data equity is very important and we all recognize it as a critically important element, there wasn't a clear, widely accepted definition in policy circles or academic literature. And all of us struggled with a way to define data equity in a way that we could put some parameters around what data equity is. We know the importance of data equity, and we know the number of different ways that it affects data-driven systems, but it was hard to define what data equity is. And without that shared understanding, all of us, stakeholders everywhere, are left to interpret and implement data equity measures based on their own, sometimes conflicting perspectives, and without a clear benchmark against which to measure our collective efforts. So one of the first things that we did on the Global Future Council was to work on this definition. Now, the council itself has been working for the last couple of years. There are about 20 of us from all over the world, from many different sectors, academia, the public sector, the private sector, civil society. But we came together, developed a definition, and then created a framework for inquiry for data equity as part of a paper that we recently published that we will post the link to around advancing data equity, an action-oriented framework. This shared definition was essential to advance collaboration and coordinated action if we were going to put data equity into practice. And you'll see this short version here on the screen, but we spent a lot of time because we recognize that while data equity is complex, it's not just a noun. It's not just something that we need to define. It's actually a verb that warrants action, that we need to address data equity actively and collectively in order to address all of the myriad issues that data equity includes when we think of it comprehensively. So we came to the final definition that data equity is a shared responsibility for fair data practices that respect and promote human rights, opportunity, and dignity. It requires strategic, participative, inclusive, and proactive collective and coordinated action if we are going to create a world where database systems promote fair, just, and beneficial outcomes for all of us. And it recognizes that data practices, from collection to stewardship to the application of insights, significantly impact all of our human rights and the resulting access to social, economic, natural, and cultural resources and opportunities. That's a broad definition for a very broad topic. And so one of the things that we then wanted to do was to think about how do we make that actionable? So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Joanne, to talk you through sort of where we landed in taking that broad definition and making it more actionable for all of us. Joanne?
Oh, thank you, Lauren, and thank you all for having me today. And so when you look at this framework, and it's a little bit hard to say on the slide, but we've attached the link in the chat. In order to move from this idea of a definition to action, the Council developed a data equity framework to enable all sorts of stakeholders to build a more equitable set of systems, processes, and practices. And we understood that data is very, very contextual in its use, in its applications, and the outcomes that it's trying to achieve. But we recognized that we had to encourage reflection, we needed to guide research, and then what we really needed to do was to prompt corrective action, as all sorts of organizations are using data to achieve various purposes, but all of these purposes impact a wide range of people. And so this is not a linear roadmap, but instead it's meant to be flexible and iterative and really a framework for inquiry, really to empower users to identify and address data equity concerns and raise consciousness as everybody is using data to achieve various outcomes in various contexts. So you can see in the middle that there are 3 categories that are key, and I just mentioned them because they are how all data inquiries begin, right? You begin with the idea of data. You begin with the idea of what am I using it for purpose, and who am I going to impact in this purpose that I'm trying to achieve? And then there are 10 corresponding characteristics with key issues for consideration, as well as a series of inquiry questions to ask that guide research and prompt those actions. So if we start with data, we asked various characteristics about the data inputs into the data analytics. And we were also, of course, thinking about machine learning and generative AI, given the world that we're living in today, recognizing that machine learning amplifies sometimes the inequities, and it's often due to the reality that our data does not always reflect the outcomes and the people that we are trying to either achieve or the people we are going to impact. And so we were looking also at the biases that we need to address early in the process and looked at issues of accessibility and sensitivity in the data, recognizing that the toggling between some of those issues, we could begin to, as Lauren said, take some action, whether it is including more data or looking at the slant in the data or recognizing we didn't have access to data that was needed for an inquiry, that some type of adjusted action was needed. Of course, every data action is for a selected purpose. And so every data analysis must begin with an understanding of what you're trying to achieve. What are you trying to accomplish? And if you don't understand the purpose and you don't understand kind of the fairness of your outcomes and the justice that you're trying to achieve, you cannot be as impactful as you may be, and you may also cause unintended harms. And so in this quadrant, we looked at the values, the trust, the originality of the use, and the application, and various attributes along those ways. And then, of course, everything we do on this planet impacts people and humanity. And so an understanding of whose data was collected and used, were their data rights represented and protected, and of course, issues of privacy and security are important. But also throughout the data lifecycle of use, we needed to make sure that we understood that there was a beneficial relationship to individuals as well as communities. We don't always think about the communities, and we needed to think about issues of relationship, expertise, accountability, responsibility, and were we actually creating outcomes that were fair to those individuals and their related communities? It was interesting because this whole framework is actually based on an indigenous model from the Maori people and the storytelling framework that describes an internal logic that is actually traditional with knowledge keepers when they're trying to share knowledge with others. And so we tried to do this recognizing that forever in humanity, we have actually been trying to change things based on our understanding of where we have been and what we are trying to achieve. So this framework is actually aligned with leading data governance principles as well as these storytelling traditions, and includes the fundamental principles of the Office of Statistics, the 5 SAFEs framework, the care, fair, and trust principles as well, because we also wanted all of the actions that are taken to align with data principles that are in existence today and are often used by a wide range of organizations. So there was a lot of consistency in our thinking, but also a methodology that really we hope is going to provide thought and care in this next generation of data use. Can you move to the next slide, please? So one of the things that we did in order to make sure that this was actionable is we gathered a series of case studies in different contexts. And we know that we've been asked many, many times for a linear roadmap or recipe in how to do this. But we also recognize that the number of ways data is used in our world is too voluminous for us to take on. So what we did instead is we published a series of case studies, and you see some of them on this slide. We applied the framework to a climate case, to women's data in financial services, racial bias in healthcare, improving urban outcomes in the city of Boston. We mapped indigenous territories, and also we did a case study with the National Statistics Office. So all of these case studies were meant to show how some parts of the framework were more applicable in different contexts than others, but nevertheless, the framework gave an ability for different organizations to enter in, make those corrective actions, that verb again that Lauren mentioned, and make some changes as they thought through how does data equity enter into the outcomes that they're trying to achieve. How did they need to think about the data they were using, the purpose they were trying to achieve, and the people that they would be impacting by this very analysis?
Thank you, Joanne. And thank you everyone for the opportunity to present this work. We've got the QR code on the screen to download this white paper that we just released. We'd love to hear from you with any feedback and any insight on the work that you yourself are doing. And if you happen to be at the UN World Data Forum in a couple of weeks, please do feel free to join us for our session where we'll be exploring this framework in a little more detail. Thanks very much and look forward to the rest of the conversation.
Thank you so much, Lauren and Joanne. It really is a truly fascinating project, and I particularly love how you guys have been learning from like indigenous practices and, you know, things that the way that people have been dealing with, even though a lot of data is new, a lot of tech is new, a lot of this is based in all the versions of human interaction, which I think is brilliant. We'll save, if anyone has any questions, we will have some time to get to those at the end, but now I'm going to hand over to Fiona to talk a little bit about the work that she does with Site Savers.
Thanks, Lydia, and welcome everyone. Thanks to GPSDD for inviting me to speak. I'm going to talk a little bit about inclusive data and what Site Savers' approach is to inclusive data, and also give a couple of examples of how we work on inclusive data, both at a global level and at a national level. So for those of you who don't know Site Savers or haven't heard of us before, we're an international NGO that works in around 30 different countries across the world. Our mission is to ensure that no one is blind from avoidable causes. We work to eliminate neglected tropical diseases, and we work to ensure that persons with disabilities participate equally in society. And really, when we're looking at that, inclusive data is a core part of what we do. And recently we've redone our vision and approach to inclusive data, which you can kind of see the screenshot of the front of our vision and approach just there. But we've also updated our inclusive data charter action plan, which is basically the commitments we've made under the inclusive data charter. So next slide, please, Fatuma. Now, I've kind of gone with a way of just having some pictures and some representation on these slides, and then I will kind of talk around it. So obviously a key part of inclusive data is ensuring that everybody counts. And, you know, it's the same that we were talking about, that Joanne and Lauren were talking about in terms of data equity, that Navina was talking about, especially including those who are normally left out or impacted by inequality or inequity. And for us at Site Savers, inclusive data means collecting data primarily on disability, sex and age, and bringing in other dimensions such as geography and income where relevant and valuable. And why that is important is we know that approximately 16% of the global population are persons with disabilities. And most countries don't have an accurate insight as to the number of persons with disabilities who live in their country. And that has implications for things like planning, for access to healthcare, for education, access to employment, and much more. We also know that countries have a commitment under the UN Convention on the Rights for Persons with Disabilities to collect data that is disaggregated by disability, and also to ensure that that collection and the legislation around data protection has confidentiality and respect for the privacies of persons with disabilities. So where do civil society organizations or NGOs like ourselves sit in that, and what is the role that we play? So a big role that we play is accountability. So accountability so that these governments will be kept accountable to the commitments that they have made signing up to a UN charter like the UN Convention for the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. It's accountability in terms of any national level policies that they have, accountability for commitments that they have made. We're also really lucky in that we can provide technical expertise, and technical expertise on a number of different levels kind of across the data value chain. So we know it's not simply enough to collect data, but we want that data to be of good quality. We want it to be used to inform policy. Next slide, please. So how we work on inclusive data. So we work on a number of different levels. We work at a global level at places like the UN and the WHO. And a lot of that is around getting commitments or getting discussions around data to ensure that the data that is being talked about is inclusive. So whether that is in the Pact for the Future that we saw coming out of the UN General Assembly this year, and ensuring that there's a commitment to disaggregate data by disability, as it's often normally just a commitment around sex or gender and age. And obviously, when we're looking at, like Navina said, those who are left out or those who are generally impacted or are in positions of vulnerability, we really want to ensure that we're monitoring that so that we can achieve the SDGs. So we are leaving no one behind. A lot of what we do is advocacy at a national and regional level. So with governments, with regional bodies, with other development actors. Like I said, it's central to ensuring that we leave no one behind, which is obviously a core aspect of the SDGs. So we're constantly talking to people around ensuring that we're collecting inclusive data that we can support in various ways. And if we're not collecting and analysing the data of all of a population, we basically cannot accurately say that we're leaving no one behind. We're really lucky in that we have a research arm, and a lot of our research includes collecting and disaggregating data. So a lot of the research done in conjunction with our programs is around how we are impacting the programs that we are running, how persons with disabilities are accessing them and increasing access or increasing participation along various kind of areas that we work in. So whether that's political participation of persons with disabilities, whether that's economic empowerment programs that we run. And then we also work within the Inclusive Data Charter, and we're a co-founding member of the Inclusive Data Charter. So why we work on inclusive data and why it's central to the need to ensure that persons with disabilities are participating equally in society is we know that the indicators on the SDGs, there's 11 indicators that require disaggregation by disability. And globally, we have data for 2 of them. So like I said previously, there's 16% of the world's population who have a disability, and they're currently not represented in a lot of data. And again, if that data is collected on participation, for example, in education, healthcare, political participation, we want data that can be disaggregated. Next slide, please. So a key part of how we work is through partnerships. So a key partner for us in everything that we do is organizations of persons with disabilities. So we work within networks, and we work directly with these organizations of persons with disabilities to ensure that they are represented in data. And it goes back to what Navina was saying about representation and community involvement. So we're in a unique position where we can help Capacity build on data, which not all organizations of persons with disabilities will have an in-depth knowledge, particularly along the data value chain. So we often talk about nothing without us. And in terms of that, what we're trying to do is get the communities that are to be represented in the data, get them involved in the discussions around data. And we've had some great successes recently in Pakistan in terms of getting disability disaggregated data into the population census. We've had success in terms of collecting data on children with disabilities in education. And a lot of that is done through things like partnerships, through networks. You can see a picture here of the community-based inclusive development network in Pakistan, and also working on ensuring that persons with disabilities are included in consultations around data value along the data value chain. So whether that's developing questionnaires, whether it's analyzing the data, a lot of what we do is around sensitization of the data and why collecting data on persons with disabilities is important. Next slide, please. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about some work that we've done in Pakistan and the work that we've done on inclusive SDGs and inclusive SDG reporting in Pakistan. So a key part of monitoring progress towards the SDGs is what's called voluntary national reviews, which are presented at the UN High-Level Political Forum. And often we find that persons with disabilities are not included in these reports. And it's kind of a little bit of a vicious circle. They're often not reported because there isn't the data available. And if there isn't the data available, there's no way to show the gaps in access that are there. There's no way to show any improvement in addressing those gaps. So we go back to why we need data and why we need it to ensure that we are truly leaving no one behind. And what has happened in Pakistan is we've worked within the networks and within the, like I said, the network on inclusive development to ensure that the Planning Commission was hosting consultations for persons with disabilities and their representative organizations. So working within these networks and working with organizations of persons with disabilities to ensure that the data and what is being reported on progress towards achieving the SDGs is inclusive. And within that, there's been great strides in promoting disaggregated indicators in the SDG monitoring dashboard of the Planning Commission in Pakistan. And the inclusion of these indicators is really important for tracking that progress towards achieving the SDGs. And with the advocacy that has happened at a national level, there's been the ability to emphasize the need for disability inclusive data in the framework and to allow for a more comprehensive understanding of how persons with disabilities are affected by various socio-economic factors and by the national development agenda. So within that sort of framing, we have been able to get quite strong references to persons with disabilities in Pakistan's most recent VNR, which was in 2019. But that was because there is data there to be able to show progress. So like I said, part of the vicious circle that we see is that people don't want to talk about inclusive data or inclusion of persons with disabilities because they don't have the data. And then there's this vicious circle. So if there's no data to compare it to, there's no want to continuously collect that data. So we do a lot basically to sensitize people towards the need of collecting the data. We work to ensure that the data is of good enough quality, that the data then informs policies to help improve the lives of persons with disabilities. Next slide, please. And this is my final slide. If you want to see some more information about how we work, our policy and advocacy page on our website shows the work we do at both global and national and regional level on advocating for inclusive policies, whether that is in terms of data or whether that's in terms of more broad inclusion. And then also we have a specific inclusive data page where you will find our vision and approach to inclusive data and also our updated inclusive data charter action plan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fiona. Sightsavers have been such a brilliant partner to the Data Values Project, and I just always love hearing about the ways in which Sightsavers does a fantastic job in really bringing people on board and like working with people. You know, there's this horrible concept of empowering people, and actually I think the model that Sightsavers has for partnership in the countries that it works in, and the example that you have for Pakistan, there's actually going to be a digest coming out about this soon. I think it's a really, really fantastic example of where building equity in data has really paid off in terms of creating change. So everyone can watch out for that. And now for our last speaker, I'm going to hand over to Maria Paula.
Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, everyone, and the previous presenters as well. Well, good morning, afternoon, and evening to everyone. Thanks as well to the Global Partnership for this event and for considering me to join this panel. My name is Maria Paula Hernandez. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands where I have been doing my research and where I'm presenting from, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Southeast Australia. I am a data values advocate for 2024, and I am also a PhD candidate in anthropology at La Trobe University in Australia. My research is about how organizations, people, and data in development relate to each other to advance distinct meanings of quantitative data. I have been doing an ethnography with an Australian development organization that has produced an individual and gender-sensitive measure of multidimensional poverty called Equality Insights. And learning what it takes to rethink the measurement of poverty in an inclusive, rigorous, and technically sound way to advocate for change. While Equality Insights is my grounding point, my research has expanded to individuals and organizations based all over the world. So the insights I'm sharing today are drawn mainly from this experience. Next slide, please. So how can academic research better contribute to equitable data practices and avoid reinforcing existing power imbalances? This is a very complex question, and I don't pretend to resolve all problems inherent to power imbalances, but I will highlight some elements that I've noticed as a person from the Global South studying the data space. First, we need to identify what existing power imbalances mean in different contexts. For me, power imbalances stem from differences in the material possibilities we can access to thrive. So power imbalances come from fundamental inequalities between people, countries, and regions, and are, from my point of view, racialized. In this sense, one first step for academic research to better contribute to equitable data is to understand its own position in relation to other actors, such as civil society and multilateral organizations. If academic research is seen as the only place capable of producing knowledge, I think that's a problem. Knowledge is produced everywhere at all times, and we have to understand it as such. It is the duty of academia and academics to find ways to meaningfully collaborate with people beyond academia, and not only institutions, if research is to matter outside of academia. That is not easy, but it's necessary. Collaboration demands time and interest from more than one party. Sometimes demands can be too high for people with fewer resources than academia may have, especially in the global north. And what constitutes meaningful collaboration is a question to be asked and dialogued in context of research. While there are many elements to address in contributing to equitable data practices, they all require academia and researchers to consider whether collaboration is relevant for them, which I think it is, and it should be, and how to embed it in a meaningful and non-tokenistic way. Next slide, please. This links quite nicely to the second question proposed to me for this panel, on the ethical considerations that I prioritize when designing data-driven research to ensure a fair representation of all communities. In most research settings, there are two ethical considerations: ethical research and research ethics. For research with people, the form of research ethics process refers to the process of reflection and documentation needed to get a research permit. In my experience, this is a relatively new requirement in many parts of the world, although it's becoming more and more common. We state there what we plan to do, for how long, how we will inform people of the research, and how they can provide and consent and withdraw consent. Ethical research is broader, older, and also less standardized than this. It depends on researchers' own ethics, the ethical climate at the time of the research. For example, ethical research meant different things in the 1920s to now, and the broader goals of research. These two concepts, research ethics and ethical research, are, or at least should be, intertwined. Now, the breadth and limited standardization of the second type of ethical research can be an issue or not, depending on the context. It can be problematic as it may leave limited room for accountability of a particular project or researcher for harm caused to research team members or participants, even if the official ethical requirements are fulfilled. But it also can be positive in that researchers can also explore with the people they're working with ways of building an ethics of collaboration that is meaningful and jointly explore other ways of knowing the world. This is how I try to approach ethics in research. My approach to knowledge, which is inspired by participatory action research approaches emerging in Latin America from the 60s, particularly through the work of Orlando Fals Borda, is rooted in collaboration, in usefulness for society, willingness to collaborate, or also respect the decisions not to collaborate, and have my approaches challenged or inspired by others. This leads us to the second bit of this question about representation of communities in research. Much anthropological research is about people's representation, but representation can have many purposes. Ethical research around representation involves two elements: how communities or individuals perceive themselves or ourselves in what they or we do, and be true to your perceptions as a researcher among the people you're working with. Sometimes there might be tensions between these two elements, and I think they should be solved by a dialogue to avoid harm. And there are times when reconciliation between those two approaches is not feasible without compromising the ethics of the researcher and of the people we're working with. For me, it matters to acknowledge these at least as challenges. And next slide, please. And the third question framing this intervention is how academic collaboration with grassroots or local organizations helps bridge gaps in data equity. This is what I explored in my project as a data values advocate. For me, ways of collaborating are decided jointly and should also involve deep reflexivity. So following my point earlier, we shouldn't assume that academia is an absolute source of knowledge or a neutral space. Academia is highly unequal in the levels of resourcing for universities and academic work based in the global North and South. Within countries, resourcing for universities vary enormously, especially between universities in regional or rural areas and those based in urban areas. Researchers are also placed in hierarchical positions mediated by gender, background, or your ability to speak or write in academic English. So in considering how academic collaboration can support bridging gaps in data equity, we need also to be aware of the limitations, both structural and individual, to doing this, to avoid unachievable expectations. And by acknowledging these, just let me go back to how ways of collaborating can be decided jointly. So for my projects with the Data Values Advocate program, I carried out 2 workshops with people in Latin America interested in reflecting about data production, use, and circulation between September and October. The aim was fostering systemic conversations with different stakeholders in the Latin American context around their plans for inclusive data. I noted that collaboration between people in universities and local organizations can open a space to reflect on methods and ways of developing and refining methods that are inclusive for all. For example, the space facilitated a conversation between people carrying out research on the conditions of informality in Bolivia, how to harmonize qualitative and quantitative data, how to enable citizen-generated data within the national statistical systems, and researching and advocating for individual level measurement for better visibility and inclusion in data. Creating such spaces for exchange can be considered an end in itself, as they enable that connection to other people working in the same space, and a place to discuss those questions about ethics and representation in data in very localized contexts. And these spaces should be supported for people whether or not they belong to an institution in order to maximize access. The value of those spaces is illustrated by the idea emerging from our 2 workshops to establish a Latin American network of situated data. And precisely the details of what that means are still to be decided in a conversation with the people involved. So while this particular initiative still has challenges in accessing localized people and organizations working around data, it is through network building, like Fiona highlighted, that we can construct something together that is powerful and meaningful. Yeah, that was it for me. Thank you.
Thank you, Maria Paula. I think it's such an important thing when thinking about academia and like how academia interacts with civil society and with marginalized groups. I think it's definitely an area that has caused a lot of worries with people with being involved in data collection and how that's carried out by academic institutions. So another one, Maria Paula, is also writing a digest about what this means in terms of like data collection. So one to watch out for. Thank you so much to all of our speakers. We have run a little bit close to the top of the hour, unfortunately. So I don't know if we're going to have a huge amount of time for questions. I mean, I think one question that I have for all the speakers, maybe if you can just answer it super quickly, is just what's the best way for people to engage with the work of your organization? I know there's been some stuff put in the chat, but most of the people within the data values community are from CSOs, they're from community-based organizations. So is there anything, if anybody wants to find out more about your work, or maybe you can speak very quickly about how civil society can best connect with the work that you have presented today. So I'll go to Lauren first, and then Fiona, and then Maria Paula.
Thanks, Lydia. I think the one thing I would say is I would take a look at the white paper. And one of the things that we found helpful was to look at the framework and look at past work and see how we might have applied that framework to past work that we had done had that framework been available. And it really started us thinking about then how we could then use those ideas to think about future work as well.
Thank you, Lauren. I really actually love that idea of going back and looking at old work. I think sometimes we just move on so quickly, we're always thinking about the next thing. So it's helpful to be able to learn from that. Fiona.
Thanks for the question. I think it really depends on what areas people are working in. A lot of the work we do on data is based around kind of our thematic priorities. So whether that's health, education, economic empowerment, political participation, and like I emphasized kind of during our presentation, we do a lot of that through networks. So whether that's the stakeholder group of persons with disabilities at a UN level, whether that is through informal networks with other civil society organizations to influence WHA or World Health Organization things. So I think if people are interested in the work that we as an organization do and want to interact with that more, I would start by having a look at our website and seeing the areas that we do work in, and then to feel free to reach out to me and I can direct them to someone who might be more relevant to what they're hoping to look at in conjunction, rather than me being the only person.
Thanks, Fiona. And just say, obviously, Site Savers are active in many, many countries around the world, across Africa, Asia, Latin America. So if there is a country that you work in that there might be crossover, do have a look at their website. And then finally, Maria Paula.
Yeah, I just would like to say that the work of engagement is really arduous, I would say, and it demands a lot of time and resources. So I would say that something that is needed is for us to precisely acknowledge that and know that like new organizations and new forms of doing that data and also new data needs are emerging constantly. So I think the need to engage with that and keep track of what is emerging is, I think, is really important, but also tremendously challenging. So yeah, it's more than a response of like a bit of the complexity of what it entails.
Thank you so much. Okay. Oh, Fiona, did you want to add anything?
I just had something that really popped into my head there when Maria Paula was talking. And something that we talk about a lot is that the enemy, perfection is the enemy of the good, and you don't need the data that you're collecting to be 100% perfect, because it's easier to make progress on imperfect data than to be so stuck that you don't do anything from the start. So while imperfect data isn't great, it's a way to take the next step upwards as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's very important words to live by. Okay, I realize that we are right at the end of the hour. So just very quickly to highlight that if anyone in this group is going to be at World Data Forum, Data Values is also going to be there. We're going to be hosting a session that Maria Paula is also going to be speaking in, but we're going to be there the whole week doing a whole bunch of different things. So please do reach out. And then finally, we have just posted a little survey that should have just popped up. We really do value your feedback in terms of what worked well for the event, what didn't work so well, what we can do different for next time. So please, if you could take a couple of minutes to fill that in, that would be much, much appreciated. And very finally, we've been speaking a little bit about the Data Values Digest. That is our that is one of the communications pieces that comes out of the Data Values Project. We have our newsletter, which is probably something that you all are signed up to if you're here, but we also have the digest, which is more our thought leadership piece. We will make sure it's linked to it in our next newsletter. I think it should be anyway. But if you're interested in writing for the Data Values Digest, we're always open to having submissions on pieces that you think would be interesting, thought-provoking, opinion-led pieces around data. So please do get in touch if you have a story that you would like to tell. And with that, I am going to close the session today. Thank you so much all for joining and for at whatever time of the day it is. I know we've really spanned all the different time zones, so I appreciate people joining late and early. And thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you at the next session towards the end of the year.
Thank you, Lydia. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.